Good evening, and welcome to another edition of The Boogeyman. On today's episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about a very serious subject to me, which is namely the horror genre, obviously. But I wanted to specifically talk about why horror. Now, what I mean by that is I get asked the question a lot, why do you like such horrific things? Why do you like the creepy crawly and the spooky, either books or novels or whatever have you? And it's something that I never really thought about until I get asked that question. And I did a little bit of research into why people might like the horror genre. I specifically used as my resources Noel Carroll's The Philosophy of Horror. Definitely recommend that book. As well as a little bit of Hans Gadamer's Truth and Method, which goes into a little bit of a specific topic that relates to the horror genre, specifically play, but I'll get to that when I get to that. Now, in The Philosophy of Horror, Noel Carroll specifically describes an issue with people who report either criticizing, critiquing horror films or horror books or what have you. And he says, too often writing about horror only emphasizes one side of horror being both attractive and repulsive. Many journalists reviewing a horror novel or movie will underscore only the repellent aspects of the work, rejecting it as disgusting, indecent, and foul. Yet this attack fails to offer any account of why people are interested in partaking of such exercises. Indeed, it renders the popularity of the genre inexplicable. And in terms of horror apologetics, I think it's an important point that just to simply disregard the entire genre as being repulsive, vile, childish, whatever adjective you want to use, really doesn't allow for its popularity, really doesn't explain why so many people enjoy the genre, why throughout history horror elements and the horror genre as a whole have been pretty much there throughout the start. When you have Beowulf, you have the monsters in the caves that he fights, and Grendel and Gore, and as he beats people with the arm. And it's been a while since I read that, obviously. But point being, it's in there. H.P. Lovecraft comments that one of the oldest elements of our storytelling is fear. And I think that's an important thing to address. It's, you know, you have the witches in Shakespeare, you have demons and ghosts and goblins pretty much as far back as we've been telling each other stories. And I think just to say, oh, well, that's childish and gross and gruesome is really simplifying that really ubiquitous element in storytelling. Now, of course, as the old saying goes, different strokes for different folks, there's all kinds of different types of horror that people kind of get attracted to. There's the splatterpunk, which is very basic, gruesome splatter, as the name implies, and is a very specific type of adrenaline, and I think adrenaline is an important aspect of that genre. And you have the gothic, which is, harkening back to Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker, and these kinds of decaying castles and mist-filled forests and wolves howling in the distance, children of the night, and all that sort of thing, which I think most kind of horror purists kind of flock to. And then you have more modern, playful expressions of horror in things like The Conjuring, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and even some of the revisionist stuff, like Friday the 31st, a segment in the highly recommended Tales from Halloween anthology. So, how do you address all of these different genres? Well, I'm going to go through specific types. And one of my favorite, personally, is what a lot of critics refer to as cosmic horror. And Noel Carroll describes it as cosmic fear for Lovecraft. And Lovecraft was one of the earliest purveyors of that specific genre. Is an exhilarating mix of fear, moral revulsion, and wonder. Now, I think these three elements are really important. Obviously, without fear, there can be no horror. So that's obviously an important aspect of it. But I think also an important aspect of it is the moral revulsion, because I think without that moral revulsion, horror doesn't really have anything at stake. If it's not questioning our morality in some way, shape, or form, if the villain specifically, or the antagonist, or even just the environment of horror isn't questioning our morality in some way, shape, or form, then we have nothing to really fear. But wonder is also another important aspect of it. Noel Carroll goes on to describe how the detective fiction and horror fiction kind of are two peas in a pod in a manner of speaking, in that they both are expressing a sort of examination. Specifically with horror, it's examining the unknown, the shadows, the lurking horrors of our minds, or our fears, or our nightmares. But either way, it turns a very close examining eye on these things, just like a detective novel would place a very focused eye on forensic details. Now, what does this wonder entail in terms of cosmic horror? Now, the interesting thing about cosmic horror is it also expresses a kind of anti-materialism. And specifically, it does so by making the human protagonists in the story very insignificant by comparison to the things they find in the dark. And I think that's important because it expresses a sort of humility of the limitations of humanity, how frail we are in comparison to the cosmos. It's a very humble experience that these protagonists go through to experience the awe of seeing these old beings like Cthulhu, and the various old ones of the Lovecraftian mythos. And I think that is an important aspect of what makes it so fun as well. Because in picturing yourself encountering this cosmic being of age-old time, of limitless size and scope, that has been around for eons and eons, or even that might be coming from far away into the stars, it really makes us understand that we are a very limited species. The materials that we work with are very finite. We can only see in certain spectrums, and Lovecraft plays with this by making some of his villains invisible to the naked eye. We exist in a very limited time frame, from 80 to 100 years or whatever the average lifespan is. And again, Lovecraft plays with this by beings that are unimaginably old and before time that as we know it. And it allows us to kind of address ourselves in a way that's as humbling as possible. And I think that anti-materialism kind of shapes a very religious feel to cosmic horror. We are but a speck of dust at the feet of the gods. Now, this serves as a constant reminder to things above and beyond materialism as we know it, either subjectively through a religious type of experience, or objectively in the scopes that I referred to earlier. And Noel Carroll goes on to say, "The morbidly unnatural is a means to awe and is taught not for its own sake, but for the state which it induces in the audience." And that state is very close to what I was getting at when I referred to a religious experience, which is an awe experience. Lovecraftian protagonists are often in awe of the things that they find lurking in the dark. And I think that's an age-old practice for us to really enjoy that experience, the experience of awe. There's a reason religion still exists. There's a reason that we flock to these sorts of stories in fiction as well. And it's partly because we love being in awe. Being in awe is itself the definition of awesome. Awesome, full of awe. That expression is self-explanatorily positive. Noel Carroll goes on to say, "Being thrilled, even frightened, albeit aesthetically, it might be said, relieves the emotional blandness of something called modern life." We're all too familiar with the fact that in modern life, we encounter awe very rarely. We might encounter awe when we encounter things like the U.S. elections. Don't worry, that's as far as I'm going into politics. I'm sick of that subject. Specifically in the Lovecraft mythos, there are these beings who are very much so outside of our realm of even being able to imagine. They are invisible, they are without time, without flesh. They control our minds and drive us mad. And these are the type of things that really kind of just swat away the assumption that by understanding the physical world around us, we understand everything there is to know. And it kind of spits in the face of that. It renders humans as insignificant, as little beings of nothingness, little specks of dirt in a great ocean of things that we just cannot fathom. And again, this serves to give us this sense of awe that really is kind of satisfying in its own right. And I think that is one little kernel of the explanation of why horror is so attractive of a genre. But it's not the only aspect of why horror is attractive as a genre, and I'll get into that. Horror also serves as a very nightmarish form of wish fulfillment. And what I mean by wish fulfillment is there is a constant desire to kind of explore everything, to experience everything that we can as human beings. So we have a wish to experience some things that we can't experience for a reason. And a prime example of this is the werewolf mythology. The werewolf mythos, in which the wish is to be free in a very animalistic way, in a very wild and free way. Now, the reason this is a very nightmarish wish fulfillment, a very be careful what you wish for type of thing, is because there's also very ugly sides of animalism. There's murder, there's a lack of control, there's chaos, and all these things that kind of come as a consequence to fulfilling that wish. Through the story of werewolves, we can experience the fulfillment of that wish and even view the consequences without actually having the consequences enforced against us. We don't have to actually experience the chaos. We can kind of experience it vicariously. So in this way, horror becomes a sort of mimesis, but a mimesis impregnated by tragedy and impregnated by these cautionary sides to things. We can express a fulfillment of wishes that are unfulfilled for a reason, but we get to fulfill them without the consequence, as if we had fulfilled them in the real world. It is a fictional fulfillment. It is a vicarious fulfillment that leaves us safe and sound in the comfort of our own home, or movie theater, or wherever you consume your horror media. I recommend on the couch with a big bag of popcorn. Yummy. Now, Noel Carroll says this: we rather choose to suffer the smart pangs of a violent emotion than the uneasy cravings of an unsatisfied desire. And he himself is quoting the Aikens, and this is in page 180 and 181 of The Philosophy of Horror. And that kind of gets to what I was saying. We can fulfill these desires without actually fulfilling them and having the consequence of actually fulfilling them. It is only a very ethereal, very play version of the fulfillment. Noel Carroll also brings up a good point that monsters by their very nature are the unnatural, and as such, it harkens back to what I was saying about the detective story earlier, where characters in horror stories often have to convince others of the existence of these monsters. They are the unnatural, they are the unknown. And when they become manifest, it becomes kind of a detective game of searching out the proofs, searching out what evidences can we bring to the populace to actually have them understand that King Kong is loose in the streets of the city. Well, that would be a really easy one because King Kong's not too small. But a better example would be in Jaws. The sheriff has to, I think he's a sheriff. The main protagonist has to convince others that there is this man-eating beast hunting people in the waters of their peaceful beach. So in a way, there's a very mixed blessing when the shark, in the case of Jaws or whatever monster have you, shows up in full form and full manifestation, where the protagonist can feel justified with the "I told you so," but it's a very, very depressing sort of "I told you so." I told you that we're all going to die. Yay! So Noel Carroll kind of describes disgust as the price of admission to this showing. We are examining the unknown, we are proving its existence, and we feel disgusted when it's fully manifest. Again, it's the price of admission to the horror genre. It is a kind of status quo. It is the currency, if you will, of the horror genre to feel disgust and revulsion and fear in the face of these manifestations. And he goes on to say, it is not that we crave disgust, but that disgust is a predictable, concomitant of disclosing the unknown. Horror is about discovering the unknown. In fact, I've heard a critic once describe science fiction and horror as being kind of the same beast, but with a different emotion behind it. They are both searching through the unknown, whereas science fiction looks at the unknown and wonders at the possibility. Horror actually looks at the unknown and says what crazy beasts there are in the darkness, what snakes in the grass that are hidden amongst the lurking shadows. And so, in science fiction, the price of admission to these wonders is a kind of what if of technology. You kind of have to have some understanding of technology and its consequences to understand the true wonder of science fiction. In horror, you have to understand the infinite possibilities of what kind of horror lurks in the dark, and that's the currency of horror. Noel Carroll goes on to describe the monsters and villains of horror as categorical violations. And what he means by that is often we see the villains in horror as being kind of a creature that does not have a category. An innocent child that is evil, such as Children of the Corn. And this kind of violates our normal understanding of children as being these innocent, very non-threatening beings. Children of the Corn goes the exact opposite and breaks that category and shows us a creature that is like nothing we see in reality. It defies the category of what it means to be children. Jaws, in the same way, violates the category of shark by being a very intelligent creature that stalks and is patient and is calculated and really kind of outsmarts the protagonists as they try to rid the beach of the shark. Normally, sharks don't play chess that well, but the shark in Jaws obviously does. So with this kind of categorical violation, it also kind of violates the category of what is appropriate to study, and a prime example of that is the Frankenstein creature. I think we all are curious about the inner workings of the human body and even the inner workings of what it means for all the matter that constitutes our personhood, how that becomes a life form. And you have the examination in a very morbid and very cautionary version of this in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in which the scientists uncover exactly how to reconstitute all the matter that makes a human being even after death, and not only that, but instill it with life. This is a categorical violation for obvious reasons. We can stitch a dead body together and in whatever form we can think of, we can't bring it back to life. But of course, during Mary Shelley's time, as the story goes, she would see a lot of these displays of galvanism, which they would add electricity to a dead body and it would flop around. And of course, with a very early understanding of what electricity entailed at the time, this kind of led to superstitions that they were pushing life back into the flesh. Obviously, that turned out not to be the case. We can't just zap a dead body in a microwave and out comes a fully living creature. That's not how that works, but I digress. Now, with all this talk about cautionary tale, why would we want to be cautioned? And I think the cautionary tale, a part of the satisfaction for the audience of a cautionary tale is this sense of righteous indignation. Not necessarily the I told you so sort of thing, but in identifying with the protagonist in any way, shape, or form, when the protagonist actually convinces the masses of the dangers of the monster, there is a sense of kind of righteous indignation, because we as an audience knew all along and were privy to the information as we went that this monster, it was an issue, even sometimes beyond what the protagonist knew. So this righteous indignation is really kind of a satisfaction of the knowledge of the unhorror, the kind of pre-horror, the world where everything is fine and dandy. We want to get back to that, and so the fear and the horror itself is kind of an I told you so. I told you not to open that box. I told you not to swim at that beach. I told you not to do this or X, Y, or Z, because you obviously now have strayed away from this cozy, perfect, happy world, and have gone into the lurking horrors of the unknown. So this I told you so is a little tiny aspect that also kind of aids in the satisfaction of the horror genre. I told you not to go there. I told you that there were scary things in the unknown, and here we've explored them. And explore is a key word as well. So the fun thing about horror is that it explores the demarcations of limitation. And what I mean by that is specifically the kind of here there be monsters on the map. And it takes it quite literally, obviously. In terms of Frankenstein, it's the limits of knowledge. We can only go so far with knowledge. So Frankenstein explores, okay, well, what if there was no limitation of knowledge? What if we could know whatever there is to know? And obviously, this is also expressed in Goethe's Faust and Marlowe's Dr. Faustus with this deal with the devil to understand everything there is to understand. So we're exploring kind of the theist crime of hubris within horror. We're exploring what happens when we cross the line, and again, we're not actually crossing the line. We're sitting on our couch eating popcorn, but we get to watch what happens when this line is crossed. We can kind of explore the unexplorable. We can see the unseen, and it's kind of the same awe that we get when we watch something along the lines of space exploration. We don't necessarily have to leave the couch to watch videos of NASA's probes and their space explorers on Mars and such things, and photographs of the vast unseeable universe. We can explore these things through the comfort of our couch with a little bit of popcorn. So the narrative kind of allows us to explore these unexplorable regions. And to me, this is the most satisfying explanation of why somebody would like horror. You get to see what you otherwise just could not see for a reason. You get to go into the belly of the beast. You get to go into the depths of the volcano and in these very dangerous places that we don't go for a reason. And that reason might be arbitrary, superstitious, it might be religious, it might be whatever the case may be, and maybe a combination of these different reasons for limiting ourselves. Within fiction, these kind of boundaries, these self-imposed boundaries that we have upon ourselves, and again, for reasons, arbitrary or significant, we get to just kind of take those off for a second and explore as much as we can through our imaginations, through our sympathies with the characters. And I think sympathy with the characters is an extremely important aspect of horror, because you obviously wouldn't be scared if you didn't care for these people, if you didn't really relate to their journeys in the unknown. Now, obviously, we have an affinity for knowledge, but there's things we cannot know. We cannot know, for example, what happens after death. You cannot know what it's like to be dead, by definition of being alive. They're two separate beings. Science can never explore death because you can't send a probe into death itself, into that other realm, whatever that other realm may be. And obviously humanity has been back and forth arguing about what that other realm might be, and that's obviously a huge topic that I'm not even going to attempt to touch, because that's obviously a very political topic as well. And remember, I said I would ixnay on the politique, so we're not going there. But point being, it's this exploration into things that we have cut ourselves off from, either because we just cannot go into, or because we do not want to. They're the scary taboos, and that's why you get something like the sadomasochism of the Hellraiser series. People can go into that, but it's a pretty scary world to go into. So, when you watch a Hellraiser type of film, you're going into these, hooks in the back and all these punctured skins sort of societies that do exist, but 50 Shades of Grey, be damned, it's a pretty scary world that most people do not want to enter into. And you can fake it all you want, 50 Shades of Grey fans, you're not fooling enough. So again, we're back to the question of why horror. I've tried to extrapolate some of the benefits of horror, and so let me kind of summarize them. To me, the most pragmatic benefit of horror is that it allows us to explore the scary, the taboo, the very dangerous aspects of reality in a way that's play. And this boils back to why I actually referenced the Gadamer text, Truth and Method, and I will explain myself. So here's a passage from that book that I photocopied specifically so I could read. And Gadamer is talking about theatrics and the arts and aesthetics, and specifically play. And Gadamer says, play itself contains its own, even sacred, seriousness. Yet in playing, all those purposive relations that determine active and caring existence have not simply disappeared, but are curiously suspended. The player himself knows that play is only play, that it exists in a world determined by the seriousness of purposes, but he does not know this in such a way that as a player he actually intends this relation to seriousness. Play fulfills its purpose only if the player loses himself in play. Seriousness is not merely something that calls us away from play, rather seriousness in playing is necessary to make the play wholly play. Someone who doesn't take the game seriously is a spoil sport. Gadamer's words, not mine. So in this way, the play of horror is exploring these very serious, dark, brooding topics that we cannot normally explore fully on our own, either because of fear, superstition, or actual being cut off from it. Like the far reaches of space, death, the possibilities of interdimensionality, all these things that we just actually cannot explore. Horror allows us to explore these things. Horror allows us to be insignificant specks of dust in a very cosmic game of horrific darkness, for lack of a better word. I don't know what you'd call it. That's the whole point of the Lovecraftian cosmic mythos. It's the unnameable, the unknowable. To actually understand it is to go mad. So yeah. But again, we're talking about the pragmatics of it. We get to explore these dangers. We get to go into the volcano without ever singeing our foot. Unless we actually burn ourselves because we eat super hot popcorn. Don't eat super hot popcorn. It's bad for you. Horror also prepares us for very emotionally dark topics. There's a lot of death in horror. There's a lot of tragedy. There's a lot of sadness in horror. At least certain examples of horror have these things. And I think this is kind of a vicarious way of living through tragedy, of living through sadness, where again we're safe on the couch. We're not actually watching a loved one die, although we have hopefully attached ourselves to characters that may die, and that emotion is technically real, in the same way that Gadamer talks about play being, we lose ourselves in play. We're still safe. At the end of the day, we turn off the movie, we laugh at ourselves for tears and fears and cheers and beers, sears. Maybe that didn't really need to happen. We turn off the movie. We walk away. We live beyond that. And it's definitely the best films and the best media and the best art obviously lingers with us after we've turned it off or set the book down. But for all constructive purposes, we're safe. We're unharmed directly. We've gotten to play and experience how to deal with these losses without actually losing anything. And I think personally that's the benefit of horror. We get to explore these scary worlds. We get to face our fears directly and understand them, and really hopefully experience them fully and survive it. There's no danger to horror. You know, the agoraphobe can explore the city without actually, having an anxiety attack. The claustrophobic can experience these very sheltered, tiny spaces, very compressed places with no exit without actually getting stuck anywhere. And the list of phobias is obviously as vast as the horror genre in general, and obviously the horror genre is very obsessed with phobias, hence clowns, spiders. There's a long laundry list of phobias that horror explores, and that exploration I think is part of the purpose of horror genre, the why fans of the genre flock to it, why people call for horror genre, why people enjoy it, why it's never not been a part of art and media. Off and on, obviously there's cycles, but it's always been a part of it. Like I said, even from Beowulf to the witches and ghosts in Shakespeare, on and on and on and on. Ad nauseum. That means till you puke. That actually is kind of what it means in Latin. Ad nauseum, to puke. Blah. Now there's also a psychological purpose to this. Obviously the practical experience of going to these untraversable lands is kind of food for our psyche to play with. But there's also something I would like to argue, and that's that horror strengthens a person's ability to encounter these horrific scenes. And I would argue horror strengthens a person's ability to frightening scenarios. Horror fans want to be scared. They will be the quickest to run towards their own phobias if they have the self-awareness to find them. They won't fear for a bump in the night, at least not without a paradoxical side dish of delight. This is metaphorically alluded to in the crime horror film Itchy the Killer, in which our protagonist, the eponymous psychopath, Itchy, encounters Kakahara, an enforcer who fulfills both sides of the term sadomasochist. That is, he enjoys the pain of others and he enjoys his own pain. He's kind of an odd duck. Kakahara manipulates Itchy, and as such, he is the antagonist, by at least the most traditional sense of the term. But no matter how much pain Itchy inflicts on Kakahara, it operates as pleasure. In this way, the film becomes a bizarre love story between Itchy, who represents the horror genre itself, and Kakahara, who represents the horror fan. Make him bleed, torture us with imagery of the most horrific machinations, and he will indeed suffer, but the suffering will be in a delicate and constant balance with pleasure. In short, horror trains us to conquer fears, to be fearless. It is not a perfect system, no play, as I mentioned with Gadamer, will ever fully prepare the participant for real versions of what it trains for. But this is the reward that keeps horror fans enamored. Every horror film endured is fear survived. Forbidden knowledge gained. Monsters encountered. And since the horror fan can return for a new fright, after all, they've been on the couch this whole time with a little bit of popcorn, conquered. And in this way, we become stronger for the fear. So that's basically my conclusion as to why people enjoy the horror genre. There's a certain rite of passage, and I think this is the most simplistic version of what I've been saying, but I think it's fair to say that it becomes a measure of one's ability to overcome fear. And I think, the horror enthusiast, the type of audience member who's really passionate about the horror genre, really seeks out those type of films that really get under the skin. The type of films that I've actually warned people against if they're not as enthusiastic about the horror genre as I am. I mean, come on. Films like a Serbian film, the Guinea Pig series, American Guinea Pig, the sort of transgressive cinema that really does their best to really torture the audience member with every bit of maliciousness that they can come across and throw at the audience member. It's really kind of the expert level horror. But I think even the most modest horror films kind of act transgressive in that way. They explore the unexplorable. They kind of cross the boundaries that we've placed upon ourselves that I talked about earlier, that are either self-inflicted because of superstitions or because of actual danger. And that's why you get things like Frankenstein playing with science that I don't think too many people would be comfortable playing with in real life. But it's fascinating to kind of imagine. Same thing with Jaws, in imagining the adrenaline and the shock to the system of encountering these man-eating beasts, Hellraiser, etc., etc. They all operate on an exploration of these unknown variables that are unknown for a reason, that can only be explored in many cases in a fictional setting. I just want to conclude that the horror genre in this way serves as a way for us to explore the things we cannot really explore, to wander through space, to look into the eyes of the beast, and really confront everything that makes us shiver, everything that makes us scared, in a way that makes us stronger for it, hopefully. In real life, when we encounter things that are difficult or frightening, hopefully that play, that practice, I guess you'd call it, hopefully makes us stronger. And that's the Boogeyman, signing out.
It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.